Hello and welcome to this video for basic sentential logic, informal fallacies, and cognitive biases. In this video, which is the first for chapter 5, I'm going to be talking about material that is, it corresponds to section 5.1, but it's only part of the 5.1 material. I'll be introducing informal fallacies and a little bit of argument analysis. The reason I say a little bit is that as these videos proceed for chapter 5, going through the fallacies, I will go through more and more argument analysis as we get more examples. But in this video, it'll be the basic introduction. What are informal fallacies? These are common errors of reasoning where the problem is not a formal problem. So if the idea is, or one way to see this, is that if you were to translate one of these arguments into formal notation, it wouldn't necessarily be clear that there was a formal problem. Another way to state the same thing is that the problem is specific to the content. So remember, one of the things that happens when we translate from real language into the formal notation is we're stripping the content out of the argument. So P or Q, not P, therefore Q, could be about pizzas, it could be about anything, but we've taken the content out. But sometimes the content is crucial. The content is important for understanding why some pieces of reasoning are good or some pieces of reasoning are bad. And the examples we're going to look at with informal fallacies are where there's something about the content generally that makes the reasoning bad. One thing to keep in mind is that in chapters 1 through 4, we were really concerned about validity and in particular distinguishing a valid argument from an invalid argument. For the most part, in chapter 5 and to some extent chapter 6, but mainly in 5, we're now looking at inductive arguments and distinguishing strong from weak inductive arguments. And informal fallacies are typically cases where arguments look inductively strong, but really they're inductively weak. Now there's two skills that are going to be required to really apply the material of chapter 5 well. One skill, and in many ways this is the deeper, more important skill, is learning how to get clear on when there is an argument and what the reasoning is. And the second skill is learning what the informal fallacies are as an aid to assessing whether the arguments, as you've identified in 1, are good and bad. That means it's a little bit misleading to call chapter 5 just informal fallacies. It makes us seem as though we're just focusing on this part of the process. But as you'll see as we go through, a lot of what you're going to be learning how to do is really this, just identifying what is an argument, what is the reasoning behind what someone's saying. And then once you've figured that out, and it's not easy a lot of the times, then this part is actually relatively easy. Here's what I mean by this being difficult. The material in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 were really artificial in a certain kind of way. And one respect in which they were artificial is that we just started out with an argument that was divided into premises and a conclusion. And then once we had that, you were just given it, we would bring formal tools to bear to assess validity and other things like equivalence and consistency and whatever. But this is actually not a trivial task in the real world, figuring out what is the argument that someone's making, what is their conclusion. Okay, so here's an example. This is a quote attributed to Ronald Reagan. "I've noticed that everyone who's for abortion has already been born." First thing, obviously, there's no premises and conclusion separated out here. There's no therefore word to tell us what the conclusion is. But hopefully you can sort of see that this is meant to be some kind of argument. It is meant to be arguing for something or against something or justifying something. It may not be clear what. We'll talk about this more in a subsequent video. But there is an argument here, but it's unclear exactly, if you were trying to formalize it, how you would go about trying to formalize it. So one of the first things we're going to try to do is to assess whether something, when somebody says something or somebody writes something, is there an argument? How can you tell whether there's an argument? One way is to ask, is it trying to persuade someone to believe something, maybe? Or is it trying to, and something that they wouldn't otherwise believe without some persuasion? People don't usually go around making arguments for things that they think everyone already believes. Or is it maybe trying to provide a justification for a belief that might be controversial? Even if you're not trying to convince somebody of something, sometimes people just try to tell you why they have the beliefs they have and justify those beliefs. What we always start off with in this class and in general, usually, is what is said or written. And in fact, in the class, everything will be written on the quizzes and on the PowerPoint slides. We'll have some English language that's written out. And that's what we're starting with. But what we're really interested in is the actual reasoning behind what that someone is using. And the key thing is that this, what is said or actually written, it's rare that that's a clear and explicit representation of the actual reasoning that's behind the scenes here. So, for example, remember the pizza argument from Chapter 1, the girl at LAX who looked in one pizza box, closed it, grabbed the other pizza box, and sat down without looking in it. This was her reasoning. And in fact, she didn't actually say anything. Okay, there was reasoning going on, but she didn't write anything down or say anything. She just went through the reasoning, grabbed a pizza, and sat down. In the case of the Reagan, I've noticed everyone who's for abortion has already been born. This is what was said. What was the reasoning, or what's the reasoning behind that? What is the nature of the argument? What are they trying to convince somebody of? What's the premise? What's the conclusion? Unclear. I'll talk about this in a subsequent video about how you might try and figure that out. But this is the thing we're interested in, the actual reasoning, because that's what we're going to assess. If it is an argument, we want to get clear on what's the conclusion. Maybe that conclusion is explicitly stated, but sometimes it's not explicitly stated. Sometimes it's implicit. It's probably controversial, or at least something that the speaker doesn't already think that the person believes. And it's not just informing someone of something. If I just say, hey, the cat's on the mat, like I can see the cat and you can't, you're curious as to where the cat is, I say the cat's on the mat. That's not an argument. Usually an argument, you can discern some premises and some reasoning behind it. That's the second thing we want to look for, is what are the premises? Again, they might be explicitly stated, they might not. They're probably not controversial. This is a clue to whether something's a premise. People don't usually use a premise or appeal to a premise that they think the person they're talking to won't accept. Once you've identified the premises conclusion clearly, then you want to see the argument structure. How is it that the person going through the reasoning thinks that those premises support that conclusion? So here's an example. Everything I've talked about so far has been pretty abstract. But here's an example, and in fact, this is one of the first ones we're going to analyze more in the next video, but just to give you something to grab onto here. This is actually from real life. At my previous institution, before I was at UCSD, I was at Pitt, and every year there was this administrative task that all faculty had to do. They had to fill out some forms, and it didn't really take that long, but this was the kind of argument that one would often hear. I know that the administrator said that filling out all these forms was crucial for obtaining financial support for the university, but I'm not doing it. Of course, an administrator wants there to be more paperwork. Without more forms to process, they'd all be out of work. There is an argument here. This person's trying to justify a belief or maybe even convince the person they're talking to of something. But it takes some work to really get clear on what that is. And here's one way that I think to understand what this is going on. And again, in the next video, we'll be talking about this more. Something like this. The administrator has argued that filling out the forms is important. This is just pretty much telling us, this premise is telling us about the administrator's argument. Premise 2. The administrator has an ulterior motive for this conclusion. Okay, and that's the second part here. Administrator wants there to be more paperwork. Without forms to process, administrators would be out of a job, right? The administrator has an ulterior motive for the conclusion. Therefore, we should reject that person's argument. And you can see there's a little bit of work required to go from this to this. Okay, but hopefully you can all see that this does kind of capture the reasoning behind the argument expressed there. Now, once you've done that, after you know there's an argument, you know what the conclusion is, you know what the premises are, you know the structure, then you can assess whether it commits an informal fallacy, whether it's fallacious, whether it's strong as opposed to weak. Okay, and this is where your knowledge of the fallacies, the specific informal fallacies we'll be talking about, comes in. And altogether, I think there's maybe, it depends on how you count, because there's 4 types of ad hominem, but either 6 or maybe 10 or 11 informal fallacies. That's where this comes in. But this is really the analysis, figuring out, is there an argument and what is it? Then applying the fallacies. So what's going to happen now, this is the end of this video, is the next, I don't know how many videos, are all going to be looking at specific fallacies so you learn the patterns of those fallacies and their definitions and so forth. Then at the very end, after we've gone through them, I'll be going through again more about argument structure and how to spot premises, conclusions, and so forth. And also we'll be continuing to do this as we work through the informal fallacies. Okay, that's it for this video. Start doing exercises right away, and good luck.